So something I've learned over the years, both in terms of business and your personal life, is it's important to be able to look at your past decisions, your past actions, your past beliefs from a non-judgmental perspective. And what I mean by that is you just look at it purely as a thought exercise. You go, okay, what did I do right here? What did I do wrong? How can I improve? And what should I keep doing as is? And by non-judgmental, I mean you're not beating yourselves up for your accidents or your mistakes, nor are you saying you're the greatest person ever. You're as much as possible trying to look at it with removing the emotions, both good and bad. And I've been thinking about that a lot with regards to COVID. In particular, predictions I made or opinions I held throughout it, and when I was right and when I was wrong, and what I can kind of learn for that going forward. Now, I think an interesting aspect of COVID was a lot of people, or most people, were wrong at various parts during it. But for a lot of people, and I would include myself in this, the opinions people had or the predictions people had were based on perfectly rational information at the time. And it's something that we often, I think people don't make the distinction. There's a difference between being like having a dumb opinion that's not based on anything and is like purely ideological or something, and being wrong. Because sometimes you have all the data, you have precedent, you have all this other stuff, and the decision or the thought process is intelligent, but it just doesn't wind up happening. Like maybe in war, you predict that your opponent is going to make a smart move, and then they don't make a smart move. And you've prepared for something logical, like you think your opponent's going to try to seize high ground or seize a strategically important position, and then they don't. You can't really say that that was a stupid or like not well thought out idea. You were just wrong. And I feel that a lot of the stuff with regards to COVID was like that. And that when I was changing my opinion on things throughout the crisis, it was in response to, I think, direct data that was being done at the time, but that was ultimately wrong. So at the beginning of this, I was kind of in full-blown panic mode because of what was coming out of China. And I will defend this because at the time it looked like it was the apocalypse. You had like people being sealed up in their own rooms. You had the Chinese economy collapse. You had nationwide lockdowns. And then it spread like rapidly, and you had all these different countries like Iran, etc., that were in complete and total chaos, and they more or less shut down, and it was just kind of gradually creeping. And the death toll seemed very high at first. And once again, particular areas it happened to hit, like in Italy and Spain, were those that were the most vulnerable to it. So I think a lot of people were initially very pro-lockdown in the face of just how over the top it was. And it's kind of interesting because at the time my opinion was that they would remove the lockdowns when things had settled down because the economy just couldn't endure permanent lockdowns, and that normalcy or the desire of the self-interest of the various parties involved with COVID, the COVID lockdowns would eventually want to remove them. Which I think actually ultimately proved to be the case, but I had kind of abandoned that opinion part of the way through and saying that they were just going to do the lockdowns indefinitely and we were going to have to wear masks for the rest of our natural life and stuff. And I think that was a rational response to what they were saying, because the experts were saying we're going to have to wear masks forever, the vaccine doesn't do anything. And I think in a lot of regards my initial thought process was, okay, there'll be the lockdowns until there's a vaccine. Once there's a vaccine, they'll just open up everything again, regardless of where we're at, because the various corporate and governmental officials can't survive an indefinite lockdown financially or economically. I think that wound up being the case, but I kind of switched from thinking it was the apocalypse to kind of that, to that it was going to go on forever. And even in Canada, which is one of the strictest lockdowns on earth, we've mostly removed all the restrictions at this point. You don't have to wear a mask even on public transit anymore. So I guess kind of the question is, how do we try to make predictions or try to make analysis in the future if even if the evidence seems to be heading in that direction? How can we kind of do better? What was kind of the mistake we made? And maybe there really is no explanation for this, that like no bigger issue. It's just you're gonna make wrong decisions, or you're gonna have bad takes, even if you're making it based on an educated guess, because it's still a guess even if it's an educated one. And you might have like a 60% chance of being right on an educated guess versus like a 20% on just a random guess, but it's still not that high enough to really be a reliable prediction. And once again, we're talking about the whole what's it called again, in hyperinflation thing and economic collapse and stuff. So people are saying that that's huge and there's the bandwagon, but maybe this will all just kind of reverse and kind of balance itself out in a couple months or a year or two, and it's just not going to happen. I think, to me, if there's any takeaway from this, so my normal position is that the inertia of the system and the interests of people with power who are so invested in the system that it is incredibly resilient, and that regardless pretty much of what happens, even if they have to patch it together with duct tape and like just splints and bandage it up, they're going to restore the system until it ultimately, something so catastrophic and over the top has to happen that it's just completely and totally irreparable. And I don't think we've really reached that point yet. I'm not even sure if we're really near that point. So I think that's, generally speaking, the way I look at these things, is that the normalcy bias of the average person, the people who have power, and just the inertia of the system itself is so strong, it's almost impossible, almost, but not entirely impossible, to make a substantive change to it. You might have changes around the edge, like very high inflation or mass election issues or other stuff, but the fundamentals are very strong in that they will stay the same. Something you kind of had with the Roman Empire during the crisis of the 3rd century and afterwards. There was a lot of internal change, but the empire did survive. It did become a lot more authoritarian and a lot more based on the use of force to keep the laws in line than it did previously, but it did survive basically a total collapse. A crisis much worse than what we're facing now. So I guess maybe my lesson from COVID is I should have stuck with my initial opinion that it might go on for a couple years, but the self-interest and the ability of the people who are running the system would eventually have to resolve itself. The problem with that, though, is the people who run the system have shown themselves to be politically suicidal in a lot of ways, as they're embracing policies that may very well lead to their extinction and them losing their power. But again, it might just be the case where they're so secure in terms of what they think they're going to get that all the affirmative action, the mass immigration, the crime, the defunding the police just won't affect them, regardless of how extreme they go. So it's kind of an interesting question. I don't really know the answer. I'm kind of interested to see what you guys think and how you feel. What are kind of the lessons and the takeaways of COVID? How can we better interpret these things and make predictions in the future based off of the experience of COVID? So just let me know what you think. I'm just kind of doing a bit of a stream of consciousness video.